Hi, everybody. Dr. Stu Hoffman, president of ChiroSecure, back again with another incredible show for you today. Today, I want to talk about record requests from insurance companies and/or anybody that's asking you for your patient records. We get so many calls from the doctors. What do I do? And the only reason they relate record requests to their malpractice insurance carrier is going back to 2005. I was the first one to see that insurance audits, post-payment audits, were going to be something that was going to come into play in the chiropractic world. And it certainly has. As a result, we added insurance audit defense protection in our base malpractice policy way back in '05. Ever since then, other carriers have tried to mimic it, at least to a certain extent. We stay the leader in this, covering insurance audits for every insurance carrier, not just Medicare or Medicaid or whatever, but we certainly include that as well. With that, we've dealt with so many audits that we understand the insurance world that much better. And when the doctor calls and asks us for advice, it's more of a proactive approach. We've worked with the same attorney for almost 10 years. We use a number of different consultants and experts in this area. But when it comes down to it, the most important thing we can do as a provider, if you're asked for a return of funds to an insurance company, is to get the expert involved. And years ago, someone introduced me indirectly to Mike Miscoe, an attorney who deals with insurance audits. You know, he's a certified biller and coder, and he has all of the credentials, but he's also an attorney dedicated to dealing on behalf of doctors working with insurance carriers. And he has helped so many of our doctors totally get out of sensitive issues with insurance companies, because insurance companies purely were doing illegal things and asking in inappropriate ways. So today's topic is really all about these insurance record requests. And I want to bring on Mike. I've gained so much respect for him over the years, even though we've never met personally. And we have talked on the phone, but we really both have the same common denominator. We both want to help our doctors do the best job possible and not be asked for anything back that's inappropriate. So, Mike, I want to welcome you to participate with us at ChiroSecure in helping educate the doctors. Can you tell us a little bit about what we're going to do today? And I know we want to put up a PowerPoint presentation to go through this. Can you help me?
Sure, Dr. Stu. Thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this, because I think a lot of early intervention in these cases when record requests come, a little bit of education, providers will have a better understanding of what they're looking at and when they need to call and when they don't, or certainly if they're still confused, how to get assistance early so that we can avoid some problematic issues that are more difficult to handle. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen if I could. So let me go ahead and show you my screen responding to record requests. And before we begin, of course, just as a brief disclaimer, I don't want attendees or folks watching this to misconstrue that your attendance or listening to this creates an attorney-client relationship or is necessarily construed as legal advice. And it'll keep me in the good graces of my bar association. The first thing that we have to look at when we deal with record requests is, there's this massive federal statute called HIPAA that controls disclosures of protected health information. And when you get a record request, you are being asked to disclose protected health information. And because of that, we have to think about our obligations under HIPAA first and foremost. And the most important change with respect to HIPAA was the HITECH Act. And what they changed of significance to these particular record requests is that prior to high tech, if you got a request from an insurance company, you could rely on the insurance company's request, because they're also a covered entity for purposes of HIPAA, as meeting your obligations under the minimum necessary disclosure rule. And what that rule says is that when you disclose information, you only disclose the information that is actually needed by the requester to accomplish whatever purpose they have for that information. Well, with high tech, I believe, and this wasn't in the comments, but because insurance carriers were abusing that in making requests for the complete chart and requesting information well beyond the scope of their audit to see what else they could find. Essentially, audits became fishing expeditions. Whether that was the reason or not, the government, the legislature changed that particular rule. And now you as a provider, when you get a request from an insurance company, you cannot rely that the amount of information that they are requesting is necessarily the minimum amount of information necessary for whatever the scope or purpose of their audit is. So what that does is it creates a burden on us, which is helpful, and we use it quite aggressively, to help or to assist us in forcing the carrier to define the purpose of their audit so that we know what records to disclose. As an example, let's say they got a complaint from a patient that said, hey, I got this explanation of benefits or remittance advice, and it says I was at Dr. Stu's office on Tuesday, April 25th, and I wasn't there that day. And so they simply need information to validate whether the patient was there on the day that you billed or not. Well, all you'd need to disclose there is a sign-in sheet, okay? You wouldn't need to disclose the complete patient chart, but nonetheless, they usually tend to ask for that. And oftentimes when they're requesting records, they don't tell you what exactly they're looking for, in which case we really can't meet our obligations under the minimum necessary disclosure rule. So this is where early intervention and a little pushback, substantiating that you're running a compliant shop, you know what you're doing, and that you're not going to get rolled over and get duped into or being intimidated into disclosing more information than you should or that you legally can. So with that in mind, these implications with respect to requests, obviously you can respond to any request from another provider. Those are called treatment requests. And when you have a patient sign your acknowledgement of receipt of your notice of privacy practices, that allows you to disclose your record to another healthcare provider, and you can disclose the entire thing. The minimum necessary disclosure rule does not apply to requests for records from another healthcare provider. But with respect to requests from insurance carriers, either for payment, and we'll talk about those are prepayment record requests, or healthcare operations, which are your utilization post-payment review requests, we have to really seriously consider what they're asking for and why, because of this pesky minimum necessary disclosure rule. And if you foolishly disclose the entire chart when you shouldn't, it may cause problems with respect to your audit result. But the other problem is now you've breached, you have a breach under HIPAA that you now have to disclose to the Office of Civil Rights, and there are very substantial fines for a negligent breach, which this would be, and they start at $50,000. So as a lawyer potentially representing you as a provider, that's my first concern, is not to walk you into a brick wall or let you walk into one by creating a breach under HIPAA. Having taken care, do you have any HIPAA related questions, Dr. Stu?
On HIPAA for 1 second, because sure. I'm so glad that's where we started. And a lot of the doctors do call and they ask, can we send this information? First, what we've always taken a position on is that if an insurance company is requesting information from the doctor, they should have a signed release from that patient to begin with.
Well, under HIPAA, that is not required, because HIPAA again, with that, when the patient comes in and becomes a patient of your practice, you, under the privacy component of the rule, you're required to either have the patient acknowledge receipt of your notice of privacy practices, which means it's posted on a wall, it's up on your website, or if they request it, you hand them a physical copy, or that you've made a good faith attempt to obtain the patient's acknowledgement, meaning you ask them to sign, they refuse to sign. My attorney told me not to sign anything. But once you've crossed that bridge, you are now permitted to release information, protected health information for what's called treatment, payment, or healthcare operations. In such a case, you do not need the patient's consent or authorization, as that's defined in HIPAA, which means it's a specific, I'm going to release this information to this place and it has a duration and the patient has the right to revoke. You don't need that for these TPO or treatment payment healthcare operation requests. So HIPAA doesn't get in the way in that context, but HIPAA does regulate what we can disclose for purposes of payment or healthcare operations under what I previously mentioned was the minimum necessary disclosure rule.
Thanks, Mike. That, I think, helps a lot of people.
Well, good. The one thing I would say about HIPAA is that oftentimes, when you get these requests, the insurance carriers suggest that they have authorization by virtue of language in their contracts with their insureds to obtain any and all of this information. And that may be true in 3 words: I don't care. HIPAA is permissive in terms of disclosure. It does not create a mandate to disclose. And as we're going to get into in this next section of how we evaluate these requests, that's the next thing I'm looking for. So let's move on if we could. So obviously we want to find out who's asking for this information. Is it Medicare, Medicaid? And that's significant because if they're asking, they're getting. Okay, we cannot use HIPAA minimum necessary disclosure objections to avoid or tailor a disclosure to Medicare or Medicaid. They have separate statutory authority whether you're a participating provider or not, especially with respect to Medicare. Then if they ask for records, you're giving them up. And you need to decide, understanding the potential scope of their audit, whether it's coding, medical necessity, documentation compliance. Oftentimes they'll request records for specific dates of service. But as we look at that, we find that to establish the necessity of a particular date of service, we may need to go beyond those dates, go back to the initial exam, treatment plan, the notes leading up to re-exams and so forth. Because when you're looking at medical necessity and you just give the notes for a particular date of service, it's like me ripping a page out of the middle of a book, handing it to you, asking you to read it, and then tell me who all the players in the story are and what's going on. It's very difficult. And unfortunately, under disclosure leads to adverse results that then create appeal sequences that again, take more time, cost more money. Commercial carriers, insurance carriers, however, we have a different analytical approach because the first thing I want to look for there is whether you're participating or not. If you're participating, meaning you have a contract with that particular insurance company, then your contract is going to define what your obligations are to participate in this utilization review process, how it gets done, whether there's repayments and so forth. Absent such a contract or language in the contract where you've agreed to participate, and it does exist in most provider contracts, then we start questioning what is our legal duty to respond. Now, that's not a decision that I would suggest that providers make unilaterally. This is a decision you need to make with counsel, but because there are certainly some risks in terms of telling a carrier, no, I'm not going to respond. The one thing that you don't want to do is just ignore it. So you can't take the position, hey, I'm non-participating, I have no legal duty once this is paid to do anything, and I'm going to ignore this. Very bad plan because a carrier may deem all the services to be denied, impose an overpayment, start recoupment, and now my only option is to go into court, get an injunction to get it stopped. And that is obviously an expensive and time-consuming process. Meanwhile, you're bleeding reimbursement because the carrier is recouping it. Licensure boards, if they're requesting information.
Before we go on to
go ahead.
licensure boards, I just wanted to ask you about these commercial carriers, because a lot of the doctors think that they have what they call a cash practice. But indeed, most cash practices are simply patient pay practices, and the patient bills their own insurance carrier with receipts from the doctor. In that case, the insurance carrier still has a right, from my understanding, to do a post-payment audit through that doctor and request the records from them. Where does the doctor stand in that type of a situation?
Well, I agree with everything you say from a factual basis, but they don't have a right to obtain the records. They can certainly request the records. And of course, if the patient's submitting the claims on their own, then and the payment isn't being assigned to the doctor really doesn't fit into that puzzle, with one exception. All of a sudden, I start caring about what information the doctor's putting on the receipt that led to the payment. So there's a legal principle that when the doctor's non-participating, it's called the voluntary payment doctrine, which essentially means that the carrier can't essentially come back after the payment was made and try to recoup the payment, even if they made the payment by either legal or factual mistake. And the law varies slightly from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but that's a pretty fundamental concept in common law across the country. The only problem with the voluntary payment doctrine as a defense is that it relies on the fact that the information generated by the doctor that the carrier relied on has to be substantively true. And I'll give you an example. Before I was an attorney, I was a forensic expert working these cases with another attorney here in Pennsylvania. And we caught this case where a doc, he thought he had a cash practice. He was handing patients receipts. They were turning them in. They were getting reimbursed. Well, it turns out, at that time, a carrier had a 15 visit limitation on manipulation. So he would give them a receipt for 15 manipulations. When those ran out, he just put an evaluation management code on the receipt. 99213, for example. And the patient was turning those in, and of course they were getting reimbursed. Well, the carrier caught wind of the pattern, 15 and then E&Ms. Next patient, 15 manip codes, then on forever E&Ms. So they initiated a post-payment case against the provider, and the hook that made assertion of the voluntary payment doctrine difficult, at least superficially, is that their allegation was that he was billing an evaluation management service in lieu of the manipulation that he performed. Fortunately, he had a SOAP note, so I could justify that the evaluation management work was performed to justify the code. But there was a fundamental concern that because he omitted the manipulation, then the carrier did not know that manipulation was performed, into which they would have bundled the E&M into the manip and they would have paid nothing. And after a substantive amount of work, there was a settlement at the end. The doc paid some money and moved on and obviously implemented corrective action. But, that type of cash practice isn't really a cash practice. A true cash practice is a practice that only does non-covered services. And to the extent the patient gets a receipt, it has a HCPCS code S8990, which represents the maintenance, palliative, preventive, non-covered nature of the service, such that if the carrier pays it, then they pay it knowing it was maintenance, wellness care. In most cases, they won't pay it. But if the patient is getting reimbursed because you're billing CMTs as if it were medically necessary care, they have an argument to say that, hey, we relied on your coding, that this was appropriate, medically necessary covered care. And when it wasn't, you should have reported this under the S code, and it can get a little messy. That doesn't mean that it's a difficult case to defend. It's just that you might have to defend it. if you want to stay completely clean and be truly a cash practice, you either don't give out receipts or you give out receipts that correctly reflect not only what was performed, but the nature and intent of the service as a non-covered service, so that the patient isn't going to get improperly reimbursed from their insurance carrier, because that's going to blow back on the doc.
I really appreciate you spending the extra time reviewing that, because so many doctors are under such a misimpression that just because they're getting paid by the patient, they're non-insurance, they have no requirements or anything else, including documentation, which goes down to your next topic. Documentation isn't just for insurance carriers. You have requirements through your licensure board.
Yes, and that's an important point. I mean, obviously, from a request perspective, every state, if they request records, you have to produce them. And if you don't, they consider that professional misconduct, and your license is subject to sanction for not complying with their investigation. But I have even recently worked a case where a doctor was sanctioned for a very abbreviated SOAP note, which technically met even Medicare's subsequent visit documentation. The sanction for deficient documentation, another provider in that same practice, they looked at his documentation, and he did the typical SALT SOAP note, same as last treatment, and it blasted all this data in to the record, most of which was probably true, but represented work that wasn't actually performed, because it was a high volume practice. They got to spend 1 minute with a patient. And so he did the SALT note. And the board was entirely happy with that note. But the note that the doc actually typed out, hitting the highlights of the subjective complaint, the location of subluxation, perform manipulation, they didn't like that note. And the most scary thing is that in their board regulations and guidance, they had absolutely no guidance on record content. So understand that from sufficiency of record, you may be subject, especially in a licensure board context, to what I call the everybody knows statute. And I have a pretty aggressive subscription to Westlaw, which is a resource that attorneys use to research the law. And I have yet to trip across the everybody knows statute, but trust me, licensure boards will apply it. And when they do, it's very difficult to get around. So even though you have this quintessential non-covered service cash practice, you still have standards of documentation that you have to comply with to avoid licensure board liability and malpractice liability as well.
Makes sense. And with these licensure boards, when they request your documentation, I just want everyone to be very, very clear on this. The first thing you should do is call us, because it means that there's an investigation that's open and active. And whatever the letter or phone call indicates, that is an investigation, and you need to notify your malpractice provider immediately, and then start putting your documentation together.
Yes, and if I could underscore one other thing in response to these requests, I believe it's coming up, but it's probably a good point to say it now. Don't panic and start fixing your records. That is a crime under Title 18 of the U.S. Code. False statements related to healthcare matters, obstruction of justice, and ultimately mail or wire fraud, depending on how you deliver the records to whoever's asking for them. So please don't do that. Call Dr. Stu. We can get you some help early on, even if it's not an appropriate time to assign a claim, to make sure that you're responding correctly. But don't make that quintessential mistake, because you're going to turn what might be a simple slap on the wrist from a licensure board, or what might potentially be a money payback or a settlement with an insurance company or Medicare. You turn it into a criminal action, which I don't believe you have coverage for, and which is going to take a long time. And now you're starting to put your license and liberty in jeopardy. So don't panic that way.
Let me hit that home, because what you're really saying is don't change the records. It's illegal. And one of the cases we had in a malpractice case a number of years ago, I read the records, and because I get all of the claims come through me first. And we had an expert witness make a recommendation to the claims department, settle this claim, and it was for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And I called him up and I said, why would you make that kind of recommendation? I read the records, I spoke to the doctor, I know what happened. And his response was, well, which set of records did you read? The one that he submitted now, or the one that he sent to an attorney a year and a half prior? And the guy got caught, and you can't put him in front of a jury. He's going to have a problem with his license, and it is a legal issue. So I don't want to let that go by lightly just because this is a PowerPoint presentation to some people. That needs to be hit home hard. You cannot change your records, but that doesn't mean you can't amend them.
That's correct. And rather than go through the instructions on how you amend and whatnot, we'll save that for for folks that are getting record requests. We'll do that another day. But don't panic and don't do self-help. I've done hundreds, if not thousands, of these cases. My guess is it's probably going to be your first rodeo for the docs on the call. If you get a record request, don't presume that you know what to do, because most docs usually don't. And I don't mean that to sound ignorant, but it's just, unfortunately, I have to put all the wheels back on the train, and it just takes more time and it complicates issues. With law enforcement requests, they have a piece of paper usually called a search warrant in hand, and it's brought to your office with people with guns. So you just get out of their way and they're taking whatever they're taking. Call your attorney, get a copy of the search warrant. Otherwise, stay out of the way and keep your mouth shut. You have plenty of time to be interviewed. Do not fall prey to if you don't want to cooperate with us, it's going to go worse. Trust me. I had a doc one time that subjected himself to one of those interviews, and he admitted to overbilling, which in his mind meant he billed for many services per visit that he actually did. The government construed that to mean that he billed for services that he did not do. And there was no way around that statement, and ended up had a plea, to a misdemeanor. He wore an ankle bracelet for 6 months and lost his license for 2 years. So be careful what you say. They're the only ones taking notes in the conversation, and only their notes matter. And it can create big problems later. Just sit on your hands, put duct tape over your mouth. You can't stop your staff from subjecting themselves to interviews, but make sure your staff is aware that you will provide separate counsel for them if they want to be interviewed. But it's best that they have counsel so that they're not implicating themselves inappropriately or you. Attorney,
Mike, can you tell us what kind of situation would have to happen for law enforcement to come in under those circumstances?
Sure. I'll give you an example. Probably one of the most compliant guys that I ever worked with. He was a client of mine way back in the beginning, back in 1995. He didn't do anything without checking it out. We had gone through an issue. He had a coding error. We did a disclosure, refunded people that we didn't even have a legal obligation to refund. He ran an up-and-up shop. Nonetheless, he had 2 angry ex-employees that teamed up on him, one of which was married to, and they looped a patient in who was married to a district magistrate. They filed a complaint with the state AG's office, and they came storming in with guns and a search warrant. And it took 3 years to put that to bed. No criminal charges were filed. He was not indicted, but it destroyed his practice. So good people can get, unfortunately, looped into these type of situations, and angry ex-employees, ex-wives, spouses are usually the culprit.
I think that's important for people to know. And it's also important to raise the point that, hey, some of this stuff can actually be scary. But yes, our intent, Mike's and mine, is not to scare anybody. It's to elevate your level of awareness so that you know what's going on. So if you should ever find yourself in any of these circumstances, you can be proactive and we can help you along the way.
Yep. And before we're done here, we'll give you some basic outlines. And there's a written document that'll help you, that'll tell you step by step how to prepare for these things. The last thing I'll address is that you routinely get requests from is attorneys. There's a thing called a subpoena duces tecum, which means bring stuff with you. You don't actually have to show up, but oftentimes these arise in work comp or auto cases. What you want to do with one of those is contact, and they usually come from the other side. So you want to pass those off to the patient's attorney, get guidance from them as to whether they want you to go ahead and produce the records, or if they're going to file a motion to quash, which means they don't want the records produced. So let the patient's attorney handle that. What you don't want to do is just respond to those and then get the patient upset at you because in responding, you maybe disclose something that hurt their case or potentially disclose something that you shouldn't have in violation of HIPAA.
And these subpoenas, a lot of personal injury attorneys will utilize them for a totally different purpose, and that is to simply not pay you to reproduce the records. Because if you have a subpoena, you need to follow it without payment. Isn't that correct?
Not always. For example, here in Pennsylvania, there's what's called a Record Copying Cost Act. So if they subpoena the records, you get paid for the research, a certain amount, so many cents per page for the first 20 pages, and then so many cents. So there's an actual state law that regulates and precludes the use of a subpoena as a means of getting around the cost of record production. But not all states have those. So that's a state-specific issue.
Thank you.
All right. We also have to look at the type of request. The most common is you get a request for records in the mail, in which case, when you get one, usually they're time sensitive. So you need to, alert your staff, if we ever get one of these, here's the process that we're going to follow. That's the appropriate time where I think you should get help. Even though not every request results in a refund demand. Most do, otherwise they wouldn't be sending it. But alert ChiroSecure that you got this request. They'll get you in touch with me. As a service to ChiroSecure members, I will give you advice on how to handle the request without charge, because obviously there's no claim yet. But we want to make sure that you respond correctly and accurately, and don't make any mistakes that'll complicate things down the road. Now, sometimes insurance investigators, because they're wannabe cops and whatever, they come storming into the office and they flash, their little IDs, special investigations, hoping to scare the crap out of you, and they want to take a magical mystery tour through your file room. That's not happening. And I've gone round and round with payers, SIU agents, where they want to tell you what records you're going to produce when they show up. And there's no way that we can. And I said, look, that's fine. But then you can sit in the waiting room for a couple weeks, 5 days, whatever, however long it takes for us to identify these records, go through them, remove information that's not necessary to respond to your request. And when we have those prepared, we'll copy them. If you need an affidavit that we're not altering any of the records, that's fine. I'll produce that. But you're not, going to access our EMR system and print stuff off and scan it or download data. That's just not happening. You couldn't let that happen under HIPAA. And then, of course, the law enforcement requests, they generally don't give you any notice that they're coming. And of course, you have to comply with their search warrant. And if they're seizing things beyond the scope of the search warrant, it's not for you to interfere with them. It'll be for your attorney to deal with later. Just remember, they have guns. You probably don't. And even if you do, it's not a good time to bring them out.
Let's go back to the in-person. requests.
Sure.
So when an insurance company
and I'm going to cover this in more detail in a minute, if that's okay.
That's great. Let's keep
So
going then.
let's just buzz through. For the mailed request, the first thing I want to look at, what's the payment status of the services that they're asking about? It's not uncommon for carriers these days where they have set up screens. Once you get to a certain number of visits, they're going to start requesting records before they're going to pay any more for services. So if they're requesting records, maybe they're requesting records for paid services, but they indicate that there are claims pending that they're trying to adjudicate. That's not a post-payment review. You don't really need to worry about it. If it is a post-payment review, the next thing we look at is this statutory or contractual basis that creates a legal duty on your part to respond. Again, help, legal help is probably necessary to help you work that out, but that's the next thing that we have to deal with. Then we look at the HIPAA disclosure, our ability to disclose what they're asking for under HIPAA. And if we have objections, again, that's where you get help to make that argument back with the payer. But assuming that we have some disclosure liability because you're participating or whatnot, then we want to look at date ranges. What are they requesting? Is there a potential limitations period that applies? If you're in Texas, they can go back 6 months. If you're in New Jersey, it's 18. If you're in Pennsylvania, it's 2 years. West Virginia, it's 18 months, I believe. So some states have look-back statutes that limit how far they can go back. That doesn't necessarily mean they can't request back further, but it just alerts us as to that they're looking back further than they can possibly recover. We have to, go ahead and cleanse the records in accordance with the minimum necessary disclosure rule. Take your time. If they give you like 38 seconds to respond to this request, that's unreasonable. Some contracts have what reasonable timeframes are, but you can always ask for more time. You can't ask for 6 months, but you can ask for a couple extra weeks in most cases. And again, don't alter the original records.
And also, don't bury your head in the sand. You need to comply so that you stay doing what you're legally obligated to be doing. Doing nothing because, well, I didn't really want to get to it, isn't a good enough answer either.
Yeah, these are, and again, we're in the assuming we have a legal duty to disclose part of this discussion. You can't, this is a priority. I have patience and I'll get around to it when I can get around to it. And, these mean insurance carriers, how dare they? You signed the contract, okay? And you obligated yourself to this. So you can't cry about, that they're asking you for these records and what a upset it is to the smooth flowing nature of your practice. So you need to prioritize this, get help, and work out a plan for how you're going to produce these records. Now, where you're non-par, again, don't sit on your hands and hope it goes away, because it won't. It just gets worse. So again, these are priority situations, and how you handle them and how you respond may change based upon your relationship with that payer. But the idea that you're just going to blow this off and they're just going to forget about you, that's not going to happen. If you have handwritten notes, I certainly recommend transcribing them, but it has to be an exact transcription and be disclosed as a transcription, and the date that the transcription was done must be indicated on the document. And then in a cover letter, we'll explain that we've provided transcriptions for you. You can prepare supplemental records, and then once you get your packet together, make an exact duplicate of everything you're sending them. Because let's assume I'm your attorney, I'm going to need that. Because my expert's going to need that. If we have the opportunity to beforehand, we'll turn it into a PDF and we'll Bates number it, which is basically we put a unique number on every single page so that we can identify A, if they're missing anything from what we sent, and B, if we need to refer them to a document later, it's easier to identify. And then finally, review the request one more time, your response, make sure that we're sending them what they need, but only what they need. And again, we can help you with that situation.
Mike, I want to touch on that though. With the insurance carriers sending only what they need, I can appreciate. But we've shared with the doctors that when it comes to Medicare, using that as a specific, they'll ask for patient notes from a specific date or a series of dates. But
Yes.
that does not give them the information that they're sometimes looking for to show objective reasoning that you did those services. So we've always gone back to letting the doctors know that they need to send a copy of their original history, their examination, consultation, and their treatment plan, so that those dates that they're now requesting make sense to someone reading that paper on the other end of a computer.
And that is an exceptional point. And when I say only what they need may be more than what they're asking for. So if, like you pointed out, if they're asking for specific dates, as we spoke about earlier, we're going to go back and provide the initial visit documentation, the treatment plan, because if we don't, those services are getting denied. I guarantee it. They'll deny because you didn't send the initial visit documentation or the treatment plan that indicated objective measurable goals, so forth and so on, and all those things will get denied. Then we'll have to appeal, provide that additional information, and we waste a step. Let's move on to the in-person request if we can. These short notice or no notice requests, oftentimes they like to do them, A, because they think they're intimidating, and B, because they're concerned potentially that, so they say, that you're going to alter the records. Of course, we're not going to alter the records. You're smarter than that now. But the other reason is that it allows them through intimidation to potentially get access to more information than you can legally disclose under HIPAA. And again, you need to be smarter than that. So your potential liabilities are, of course, breach and an audit result that where in the middle of the audit, because they have all this extra information that they otherwise wouldn't have had and they weren't entitled to, the scope of the audit changes in the middle of the audit and it gets worse. So how to deal with this is obviously you get help early. But if someone were to show up unannounced, ID them. Demand a picture ID, make a copy, and then call their supervisor to verify who they are and that they're supposed to be where they are doing what they're doing. Okay. And that's going to put them back on their heels because they're not used to that. But, think back to the red flag rules with patients. I mean, you have the same obligation. You don't know. Anybody could walk in and say, and make, in today's day, being able to, digitally create anything. I could create an ID that says I'm, Blue Cross Blue Shield Special Investigations Unit and come in and grab records, and I'm none of the above. So that's why you need to ID these folks. Verify that you have an obligation to disclose. So once you know who they are we contracted with them? And sometimes it can even get down to the particular member benefit contract. Is it something that's within your contract with the payer? Have the investigator identify what patients they want, what dates of service they want, and what the purpose of their request is, so you know not only how to respond, but how much information you have to disclose, either limit it to those dates or maybe you need to disclose more. And then you're going to have to tell them, look, it's going to take us some time to put this together. So, usually you're in the middle of patients, and we don't have time to do this now. And you're going to have to schedule a pickup time later. If they don't want to do that, then that's where you put your lawyer in contact with them, so that we can explain how this is going to go. And they push back hard, and eventually you work something out. But I was like, look, we're happy to give you the records, but we're not going to violate HIPAA to do it. And no judge on the planet is going to interpret your obligations under your provider contract as requiring you to violate the HIPAA statute. Those provisions would be considered void against public policy. You can read these on your own. They're pretty self-explanatory. But the one thing I think is critical, some of these folks are really smart. They wait for the doc to leave for lunch, and then they go in and try to intimidate your front desk person. So you got to make sure that you train your folks. You know, who's the contact person? Who are we going to call if this happens? And remember, you never, ever leave that investigator alone. In fact, they never make it past the front desk. Okay. But once you get through all these preliminary things, to the extent that they're, you know, maybe they only want 5 charts and you have the time to do it, and willing to sit in the waiting room and wait, you know, then you just follow the process for a mailed in request at this point. The search warrant, I mean, obviously you're going to panic. I'm going to tell you not to panic, and it doesn't matter. You're still going to panic. But don't let panic interfere with your the functioning of your brain. Who's going to interface with law enforcement? You know, it could be your compliance person. It could be the doctor. If the doctor's not there, I mean, you have a hierarchy for who's going to react. And this person has not only know who we're going to call in terms of legal counsel, but their phone number has to be handy, and what the mechanism is for getting that person on board immediately. Asked to read the warrant, verify the location of the search and the items they're looking for clearly and correctly identified. If they're not, I mean, you can point that out to them, but you cannot interfere with them. Assert your rights to be represented by counsel, be respectful, and again, don't interfere with them. Let them do their job. Stay out of their way, and like I said, avoid interviews at this stage of the game unless counsel's present to handle that with you. Okay. With that, you know, any request, who's it from, what's our duty to disclose, and if we have a duty, what can we legally disclose under HIPAA? Set up procedures in your office for dealing with no notice and on-site requests so that those don't go awry. How we're going to deal with subpoenas. Of course, we're going to call the patient's attorney on that. Search warrants, we're going to let them do what they got to do. But if you address these issues with your staff, document it as part of your compliance training, of course. But these things can happen. And when they happen, figuring out at that moment what you're going to do rather than having a plan in place is a really bad idea. You know, make sure you have your outlets, your contacts. Don't hesitate to call Dr. Stu. They can give you some good preliminary advice or put you in contact with me if it sounds like something's messy. And as a closing point, there's one type of request that people get, and it generates calls, and I thought it'd be worth 30 seconds, Doc. And that's requests from Medicare Advantage plans. They usually contract with some third party who is going to request records, and it has nothing to do with you. If you look at the request, you'll see the magic words risk adjustment or HCC risk adjustment. And what they're doing is collecting clinical data on the patient to the extent that it might impact what's called that patient's HCC risk adjustment score, which Medicare Advantage or Part C plan insurance carriers who basically provide Medicare coverage outside the Part B program, how they get paid from Medicare is based upon how sick the patient is. So the sicker the patient is, the more money they get. So they're looking for your records to either substantiate the risk adjustment score that they're reporting or to justify a higher score so that they can get more money on that patient in the next reporting period. Those are not a problem when you get one. That's the magic language, but it will always come from usually a third party contractor that's been contracted on behalf of, say, Humana or United Healthcare or some Blues Medicare Advantage plan. And usually there's a disclosure in there or some statement that says risk adjustment or HCC risk adjustment. And those ones you don't need to worry about. If you're unsure, scan it, blast it off to Dr. Stu. He can blast it off to me. We can confirm that. And then you can breathe a big sigh of relief. But those ones you don't need to worry about.
Mike, this information I think is totally invaluable to the doctors. Let's face it, most of the requests are going to be mailed requests, as you label it. But we do get these calls, people, and you should be prepared and know how to deal with each and every one of these situations. And that's why we associate with people like Mike Miscoe here, who is one of the foremost experts in the entire country and we utilize him to help you. So this information, I hope that you'll take and utilize so that you know exactly what to do. And I think one of the most important points was one of the simplest and most quickly gone after or gone over, and that was educate your staff. You know, your staff needs to know what to do with these requests. If someone shows up in the office that's from law enforcement or from the licensing board or from the state or from an insurance company, but even if it's a mailed request, you should have an office policy of how each one of these things gets addressed. And that's how you run a business. So when I get a call from a doctor that says, oh man, my staff sent in the records on this person and they sent too many things and I didn't want them to do this, that, or the other thing, what do I do now? You know, my attitude is, I don't know. That's why we deal with attorneys like Mike Miscoe, who is, you know, the celebrity in our arena that helps our doctors out. So I want to thank you, Mike, for participating with us and helping educate the doctors. I think that there's so much information to take away from this that I think it's incredible. And we didn't get into what should be in your records. This was all about how to handle a records request. So I want to thank everybody for participating with us. And I look forward to bringing Mike back on another time to educate us on more topics like this. Thank you.